The air in the dance studio hung thick with the scent of rosin and sweat, every breath a reminder of the discipline that bound us here. I stood at the bar, muscles trembling from the final pirouette, when Coach Elena's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp, unyielding. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on me from across the room, her posture a fortress of controlled power in that fitted black tracksuit that clung to her form like a second skin. In my exhaustion, I'd left my phone on the bench, voice note still recording my whispered fantasy of her hands guiding more than just my steps. Her breath warm against my neck in the dim light after hours. The realization hit like a dropped beat. The file had auto-sent to the team's shared drive. My heart seized. This wasn't just a slip. It was exposure, raw and irrevocable, shattering the wall between student and authority. The stakes clawed at me. My place on the team, her reputation, the unspoken longing I'd buried under every correction. Then came the message. See me in my office, tomorrow. That rehearsal had been merciless, the kind that stripped away pretenses and left only the raw mechanics of the body. We'd been at it for hours, under the studio's unforgiving fluorescence, mirrors reflecting back every flaw in our alignment, every hesitation in our extensions. Elena paced the floor with that deliberate stride of hers, her presence filling the space like a low hum of electricity, commanding without raising her voice above a murmur. I could feel her gaze on me even when I faced away, tracing the line of my spine as I arched into a grand jeté, her corrections landing not as words, but as echoes in my limbs. Tighter core, Lila, she'd said earlier, her hand pressing briefly against my abdomen to adjust, the warmth of her palm seeping through the thin fabric of my leotard, lingering just a fraction too long before she pulled away. It was those moments that unraveled me, the professional touch that ignited something deeper, a forbidden current running from her fingertips to the ache coiled in my chest. As the session dragged on, fatigue settled into my bones like lead, each plie heavier than the last. The other dancers had filtered out one by one, murmuring goodbyes, but I stayed, compelled by that magnetic pull toward her, the way her dark hair escaped its severe bun in wisps that softened her otherwise immaculate severity, or how her voice, low and measured, wrapped around instructions like velvet over steel. I wiped sweat from my brow and sank onto the bench, pulling out my phone, not to check the time, but to capture the whirlwind in my mind. The voice note app was already open from earlier, a habit for jotting choreography ideas, but tonight it became something else. My thumb hovered, then pressed record, the words spilling out in a hushed rush born of isolation and exhaustion. God, Elena's hands today. Imagining them not correcting, but claiming. Pulling me close in the empty studio, her breath steady against my skin as she traces the lines she's taught me to perfect, turning discipline into something intimate, her reserve cracking just for me. The fantasy unfolded in my whisper, vivid and unfiltered, the press of her body guiding mine not across the floor but into surrender, the power she wielded in every rehearsal inverting into a shared vulnerability, her unblinking stare softening into desire that mirrored my own hidden longing. I stopped the recording, heart pounding, not from the dance, but from the confession I'd just immortalized, a private sanctuary of thought, now digitized. Tucking the phone into my bag, I gathered my things and left without a backward glance, the studio's echoes fading behind me. But in the haze of leaving, I'd forgotten to delete it. And worse, the app's auto-sync feature, meant for backing up practice notes, had kicked in silently, uploading the file to the team's shared drive for collaborative feedback, a tool we'd used for music and routines. It wasn't until I was home, collapsing onto my bed with muscles screaming, that the dread began to creep in. I replayed the session in my mind. Elena's final nod of approval, her eyes lingering on my form as I stretched. that subtle shift in her posture when our gazes met in the mirror. Had she noticed anything amiss? No alert came, no immediate fallout, but the silence gnawed at me through the night, my thoughts racing through the catastrophe. If she heard it, listened to my voice unraveling her authority into fantasy, the boundary I'd towed for months would shatter. My scholarship, the team's dynamic, her carefully guarded isolation, all could crumble under the weight of one unguarded moment. Yet beneath the panic stirred something treacherous, a flicker of hope that she might feel the echo of that pull, the undeniable magnetism that had drawn my words out in the first place. The next morning brought no reprieve, only amplified anticipation. Practice resumed as usual, but Elena's instructions carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, her voice steady, yet her glances sharper, as if dissecting more than my technique. The shared drive remained untouched in my checks, but the uncertainty built like tension in a lift, every shared space in the studio charged with what might come. Whispers of the summons echoed in my head, pulling me toward the inevitable confrontation. The office door, a threshold I both dreaded and craved. I arrived at the studio an hour before the scheduled practice. The early morning light filtering through the high windows in pale shafts that did little to warm the space. The air still carried the faint, acrid tang of yesterday's sweat, mingled with the sharp bite of rosin dust, a scent that clung to everything like an unspoken accusation. Echoes of phantom footsteps bounced off the mirrored walls, amplifying the isolation that wrapped around me, turning the vast room into a cage of my own making. I dropped my bag by the bar and began my stretches, but my body moved on autopilot, muscles loosening while my mind replayed the fragments of interactions that had fed the fantasy's fire. Those fleeting corrections, where Elena's fingers had grazed my shoulder, steadying my turn, her touch a command that lingered in my skin long after she'd stepped back. Every moment with her replayed in vivid loops. The way she'd demonstrated a lift last week, her form impeccable, muscles coiling with restrained power under her tracksuit, her breath even as she positioned my limbs with precision that bordered on intimacy. I'd felt the heat radiating from her proximity then, the subtle shift in the air as her unreadable facade held firm, revealing nothing of the storm she might harbor beneath. Her reserve was a fortress, built from years of authority in this world of live bodies and rigid lines, where power flowed from her gaze alone, dissecting our forms, enforcing discipline without a raised voice. Yet in those private adjustments, when the others had paused for water, her hand on the small of my back to realign my posture, there was a flicker, a momentary softening in her grip that hinted at the vulnerability she buried deep. It was those cracks that had woven into my whispered confession, turning professional guidance into a tapestry of longing, where her control over my movements blurred into something profoundly personal, an inversion of roles that left me aching for reciprocity. I flowed into a series of pliés, the wooden floor creaking softly under my feet, but concentration eluded me, shattered by the war raging inside. Fear clawed at my chest, the rejection that could end my season, strip away the scholarship tying me to this team, expose me as the one who'd crossed the invisible line. Elena's neutral tone and messages, always clipped and professional, offered no clues. Was it disdain brewing? Or something more layered? A mirror to the turmoil I'd unleashed. Yet threaded through the dread was that forbidden hope, treacherous and insistent, whispering that she might recognize the depth of it, the way her presence had carved itself into my every extension and release. What if her stare in the office held not judgment, but an echo of the same undeniable pull, her reserve fracturing under the weight of shared secrets? The thought sent a shiver through me, not from the cool draft slipping under the door, but from the possibility of her reciprocation, turning isolation into connection. My heart pounded as the assistant, Maria, pushed through the studio door, her clipboard clutched like a shield. She scanned the empty space, spotting me mid-stretch, and approached with that efficient stride, her expression a mask of neutrality that only heightened my pulse. "Lila," she said, voice even, "Coach Elena wants to see you in her office before practice starts. She mentioned it this morning, said to come right away." Her tone carried no inflection, just the relay of instructions, but I dissected it anyway, searching for undertones in the coach's relayed neutrality. Was it a shield against discomfort, or the calm before a storm of confrontation? I nodded, forcing composure as I straightened, the leotard suddenly feeling too exposing under her casual glance. "Thanks," I murmured, grabbing my towel to wipe away the sheen of nervous sweat. But inside, the battle intensified, fear of her cold dismissal warring with the illicit spark of hope that this summons might bridge the chasm, her staring eyes finally revealing the longing I'd imagined in my fantasy. As I made my way down the dim hallway toward her office, the fluorescent hum overhead seemed to pulse in time with my footsteps, the charged space between us already igniting before I'd even crossed the threshold. The door loomed ahead, a portal to whatever truth awaited, pulling me forward into the heart of the tension. I pushed open the door to Elena's office, the hinges whispering a protest that echoed my own reluctance. The room was a stark contrast to the studio's expanse, a compact sanctuary of polished wood and stacked files. The air cooler here, laced with the faint, clean scent of her citrus shampoo mingling with the musty undertone of old score sheets. She sat behind her desk, ramrod straight in that black tracksuit, her dark hair pulled into an impeccable bun that betrayed no strand out of place. But it was her eyes that arrested me, fixed in an intense, unblinking scrutiny that pinned me in place the moment I crossed the threshold. Those deep brown depths held no flicker of anger or surprise, just a steady, dissecting gaze that stripped away my defenses, leaving me exposed under the weight of what she'd surely heard. I closed the door behind me with a soft click, the sound amplifying in the confined space, and stood there, bag clutched like a lifeline against my chest. My mouth opened, but the words tangled, emerging in a stammered rush that betrayed the vulnerability crashing through me. "Coach Elena, I'm so sorry." The voice note, it was private, meant for no one. I didn't realize the sync. I swear, it won't happen again. My voice faltered, cracking on the last syllable as heat flooded my cheeks, the exposed rawness of my fantasy hanging between us like a tangible thread. I'd poured out that intimate unraveling, her hands not just guiding steps but claiming curves, her breath a steady anchor in the dim after-hours glow. And now it echoed unspoken in this room, my longing laid bare before the very authority it idolized. Elena didn't interrupt, her composure a fortress unbroken, fingers tightening imperceptibly around the pen she held, the subtle whitening of her knuckles the only betrayal of the charge beneath her steady breath. She leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under her controlled weight, and regarded me with that measured poise, her voice emerging low and deliberate, probing without accusation. "Lila, sit, and tell me, was it authentic? That whisper, the one describing hands tracing lines beyond choreography, breath against skin in the empty studio. Was it a fleeting thought, or something rooted deeper?" Her words sliced through the air, not harsh but insistent, demanding truth without shattering her reserve. Her breath remained even, yet I sensed the undercurrent, a charged rhythm that mirrored the pulse in my veins, her unyielding facade holding firm even as the question hung, inviting confession. I sank into the chair opposite her, the leather cool against my leotard-clad legs, and met her gaze as best I could, though it felt like staring into a storm held at bay. The fantasy's roots revealed themselves then, unbidden in my mind's revelation, a accumulation of longing from countless shared rehearsals where her corrections had woven into my every fiber. It started with the first private session months ago, her hand on my waist to steady a fouette, the firmness inverting into a spark that lingered through nights of restless dreams, escalated in the late practices when her voice, velvet over command, would murmur adjustments close enough for me to catch the warmth of her exhale. Each touch, each lingering glance in the mirror had built this ache, turning discipline into a silent dialogue of desire, her power over my form blurring into a yearning for her to see me not just as a dancer, but as the woman unraveling under her influence. It was real, I admitted, voice steadier now, though my hands twisted in my lap. Every word, from the way your guidance feels like more than instruction, the reserve you carry that makes me wonder what's beneath. It's been building, in the quiet after everyone leaves, in the way you steady me. The silence stretched after my words, heavy and charged. Her fingers finally releasing the pen with a soft clatter that broke the tension just enough to breathe. Elena's eyes softened a fraction, not in warmth, but in acknowledgement. Her posture shifting subtly, as if the weight of my revelation pressed against her own guarded walls. Then, in a voice threaded with something unspoken, she admitted, "I've noticed your gaze, Lila, in the mirrors, during those adjustments. The way it holds longer than necessary, mirroring what you described." The dynamic shifted then, subtly. Her confession a crack in the facade that drew us closer without a single step. The air between us humming with the possibility of reciprocity, pulling the confrontation deeper into uncharted territory. Elena's admission hung in the air, a fragile thread pulling at the edges of her composure. And for the first time, I saw the fortress waver. She rose from her chair with a deliberate slowness, the movement betraying a subtle tension in her shoulders, and crossed to the narrow window overlooking the empty practice field beyond the studio wing. Her back turned to me, the tracksuit fabric stretching taut across her frame. She stood there silhouetted against the gray afternoon light filtering through the blinds, her posture seeping with a vulnerability she could no longer fully contain. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. And I watched the rigid line of her spine soften, just enough to hint at the isolation she carried like an invisible weight. When she spoke, her voice was lower, threaded with a rawness that pierced her usual reserve. "Lila, you have no idea the war this creates in me. Boundaries aren't just rules here, they're survival. I've built my life around them, coaching teams like ours for over a decade, sacrificing any chance at connection, because one slip could unravel everything. Personal isolation? It's not a choice. It's the price of authority in a space where power imbalances can destroy lives." She paused, her fingers curling against the windowsill, knuckles paling as if gripping for stability. Hearing your voice note, it didn't repulse me. It echoed something I've buried deep, the way your form under my hands during rehearsals stirs a longing I can't afford. But acknowledging it, that fractures the control I've fought to maintain, turns the studio from a sanctuary of discipline into a cage for what we both feel but can't name. My confession deepened in response, the words tumbling out as if her vulnerability had unlocked my own, drawing me to the edge of the chair. "It's the ache during every training session, Elena. The unspoken desire that builds with each correction, your hand on my waist steadying a turn, sending ripples through me that have nothing to do with technique. I've felt trapped in it, watching you command the room with that unyielding poise, wondering if the reserve masks a mirror to my turmoil. The power you hold over us, over me, amplifies it all. You're the one who shapes our limits, yet in those quiet adjustments, it feels like you're reshaping something deeper, pulling at the longing I've hidden behind every perfect arabesque. The truth poured forth, mapping the emotional terrain between us, the imbalance where her authority loomed like a shadow, both confining and exhilarating. The studio a dual realm, cage of rigid expectations, sanctuary where stolen glances hinted at release. She turned then, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of that same ache, and stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to mere feet. In a gesture born of habit yet laced with intimacy, her hand rose to brush my shoulder, ostensibly to adjust the strap of my leotard that had slipped during my nervous fidgeting. But the touch lingered, her palm warm and steady against my skin, tracing a slow path down my arm before pulling away. The contact ignited the air, her breath catching faintly, the proximity turning the office into a charged enclave where professional lines blurred into personal gravity. I felt the pull, undeniable and magnetic, her reserve cracking further as our gazes held, vulnerability seeping through like light through fissures. The moment suspended us, but reality pressed in, and she stepped back, composing herself with visible effort. "We can't let this consume us here," she murmured, though her voice carried the weight of reluctance. Days passed after that office encounter, rehearsals resuming with a new undercurrent, every practice laced with tension where her instructions sharpened, yet our glances lingered longer than necessary. Her eyes tracing my extensions with an intensity that spoke volumes unspoken, pulling us toward the inevitable escalation. Rehearsals dragged us back into the studio's unforgiving rhythm, but nothing felt the same after that office exchange. Every correction now hummed with electric undercurrents, invisible threads pulling taut between us. The mirrors captured it all. Elena's form moving with that same deliberate precision, her tracksuit a barrier that did little to contain the tension radiating from her. I'd catch her directing the group through a sequence of lifts, her voice steady as she called out alignments. Yet when her eyes met mine in the reflection, they held a depth that spoke of shared secrets, sharpening the air around us. The other dancers flowed through their routines oblivious, their laughter punctuating the music. But for me, each step carried the weight of her proximity, the space we'd cracked open refusing to seal. My body betrayed me at every turn, responding involuntarily to her touches that once seemed purely instructional. During a partnering exercise, she positioned herself behind me for a supported arabesque, her hand pressing firmly against the small of my back to guide my arch, the warmth seeping through fabric like a promise unspoken. The contact sent a shiver racing up my spine, muscles tightening not from strain, but from the heightened awareness it ignited, an ache that bloomed low in my core, forcing me to focus on breath alone to maintain form. Her fingers lingered a beat longer than necessary, adjusting my hip with a subtle pressure that blurred the line between correction and caress, her breath brushing my ear in the quiet between counts. I felt exposed under her gaze, the studio's fluorescence casting shadows that danced like echoes of my fantasy, turning discipline into a silent interrogation of desire. Elena's voice wove through it all, low and deliberate, masking the turmoil I sensed brewing beneath her reserve, with commands that landed like veiled intimacies. "Extend further, Lila. Feel the line from here," she'd murmur during a solo, her words wrapping around me as she demonstrated nearby. Her own extension, a study in controlled grace that drew my eyes despite the risk. Each instruction felt layered now, her tone a velvet sheath over steel, concealing the conflict she'd confessed while evoking the desperate proximity I'd whispered into that voice note. In the quiet lulls, when the music paused for resets, I'd ruminate on how the fantasy had evolved since that slip. Once a solitary indulgence born of exhaustion, It now blended the rigor of our sessions with a yearning for her to bridge the gap, her authority inverting into a mutual unraveling where corrections became explorations, her unyielding poise giving way to the vulnerability we'd both glimpsed. The escalation built subtly, crusting in moments stolen from the group's flow. One afternoon, as sweat beaded on our skin and the air thickened with exertion, Elena called a water break, her nod dismissing the others to the benches while she lingered by the cooler, filling a bottle with deliberate slowness. I approached, compelled by the pull, the silence between us stretching heavy and charged, thicker than the humidity clinging to the walls. Our fingers brushed as I reached for my own bottle beside hers, a fleeting accident that rooted me in place, her eyes lifting to meet mine with an intensity that mirrored the storm inside. No words passed, just that shared breath, the space humming with the weight of what we'd left unsaid, her reserve holding like a dam against the flood of longing we'd awakened. She turned away first, but the moment etched itself, amplifying the magnetism that made every subsequent practice a tightrope walk over forbidden depths. Yet, the outside world intruded, an external complication forcing our tension into sharper relief. A team scout from the regional circuit scheduled to observe our final run-through that week. Her presence a catalyst that demanded we confront the undercurrents before they surfaced under scrutiny. The scout arrived mid-morning, her presence slicing through the studio like an uninvited spotlight, clipboard in hand and eyes sharp as she claimed a spot along the wall. Nadia, the regional coordinator from the Circuit League, embodied the external gaze we'd all feared. Professional, detached, her tailored blazer a stark contrast to our sweat-damp leotards, her notes a potential verdict on our season. She nodded curtly to Elena, who acknowledged her with that impeccable reserve. But as the run-through began, I felt the shift immediately. Every glance between us now carried the risk of scrutiny, our unspoken magnetism amplified under her watchful eye. We launched into the ensemble sequence, bodies sinking in a whirl of extensions and lifts, the music's pulse masking the tension coiling in my gut. Elena directed from the center, her voice a steady anchor. But when she paused to adjust my placement in the formation, her hand grazing my elbow with that familiar, lingering pressure, Nadia's pen scratched audibly against paper. The correction was routine, her fingers tracing a quick path to realign my shoulder, warmth blooming where they pressed. But in the mirror, I caught Nadia's brow furrowing, her gaze flicking between us. Favoritism, she murmured to the assistant hovering nearby, her voice low, but carrying in the brief silence between tracks. Elena's too attentive with that one. Lila, right? The words landed like a misstep, fueling the whispers that rippled through the group as we reset. Sidelong looks from teammates, murmurs of, always her, and what's special about Lila, that twisted in my ears, igniting fear of exposure that could end everything. The scholarship dangling by a thread, my spot on the team eroded by perceptions of impropriety. The practice dragged, each interaction dissected in my mind. Elena's nod of approval after my solo, her eyes holding mine a fraction too long, now weaponized under Nadia's lens. By the final bow, exhaustion mingled with dread, the scouts' feedback session looming like judgment. As the others dispersed, towels slung over shoulders and chatter fading down the hall, Elena's gaze found me across the emptying floor, conflicted resolve etching lines around her mouth. She gestured subtly, pulling me aside into the shadowed alcove by the equipment racks, away from lingering eyes. Her face a mask that barely concealed the storm beneath, jaw set, but eyes betraying the flicker of turmoil we'd ignited. "Lila," she began, voice hushed and edged with urgency, her proximity in the dim space sending that familiar charge through me. Nadia saw it, the way I correct you, the glances. She's questioning favoritism, and if that spreads... She trailed off, her hand hovering near my arm before dropping, the restraint of visible effort. This job, this authority, It's all I've known for 15 years. I sacrificed connections early on, watching colleagues pair off while I stayed isolated, pouring everything into coaching to avoid the risks of entanglement. One whisper of bias, and it unravels. My credibility, the team's trust, your future here. We've already crossed lines in our minds. Letting it show could cost us both. Her history unfolded in fragments, vulnerability seeping through the cracks, nights alone after seasons, the weight of authority that isolated her from the very intimacy she'd glimpsed in my fantasy, her reserve a shield forged from lost chances. I leaned closer, the alcove's confines amplifying the heat between us, and pleaded, "Elena, be honest with me. Does the risk scare you more than the truth? That voice note wasn't just a slip. It was a bridge to what's real between us. The longing that's mirrored in your touches, your stares. Denying it now, under scrutiny, only cages us deeper. If we hide, it festers. If we face it, maybe we find a way through. The power, the isolation, to something shared." She held my gaze, the mask slipping further, resolve warring with the pull we'd acknowledged. The scout's voice echoed faintly from the hall, wrapping up notes, but Elena's nod was resolute. "Not here. My office. Now." The private meeting beckoned, reigniting that intense stare as we slipped away. The door closing behind us, a threshold pushing us toward boundary testing. The air thick with the weight of what we'd no longer contain. The office door clicked shut behind us, sealing the world outside into irrelevance. But Elena didn't return to her desk. Instead, she gestured toward the adjoining practice room, a smaller annex used for one-on-one sessions, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as she flicked the switch. It was late, the main studio long emptied, the building's corridors silent, save for the distant hum of a janitor's cart. We'd agreed to this under the guise of clarifying technique after the scout's intrusion, but the air thickened immediately, charged with the intent we'd skirted all day. She locked the door with a decisive turn, the sound echoing like a concession, and faced me under the harsh glow that cast long shadows across the scuffed floor. "We need to address this head-on," she said, her voice low, threaded with the resolve that had pulled us here. "Before Nadia files her report, before whispers become actions. Show me your solo from the sequence. Let's see if the favoritism she perceived has any basis in your form." I nodded, slipping into position at the center of the room, the cool air raising goose flesh on my arms where my leotard left skin bare. The music started from her phone, a slow, haunting melody that underscored the intimacy of the space. Just us. No mirrors to mediate, no audience to perform for. My body moved on instinct, arms unfolding into a graceful arc, legs extending in a controlled lift that tested balance and breath. But Elena's instructions wove through it, turning routine into something profoundly intimate. She circled me slowly, her presence a gravitational force, and when I faltered on the descent, nerves betraying my focus, her hand found my waist, steadying with a warmth that seeped through fabric. Fingers splaying just enough to guide without commanding, sweat began to dampen my skin from the effort, a fine sheen that made every shift slick. And as I pivoted into the next phrase, her touch lingered on my lower back, tracing the curve to realign my posture, the pressure firm, yet yielding, evoking the fantasy I'd confessed without naming it. The fluorescence hummed overhead, illuminating the subtle play of light on her face as she stepped closer for the partnering element, her unreadable eyes betraying a flicker of longing that mirrored the storm raging in my chest. An internal tempest of fear and yearning, the power dynamic twisting into something reciprocal under this solitary scrutiny. Her breath came steady, but I caught the faint acceleration when our forms aligned, her hand sliding up to steady my shoulder for the lift, the contact sending a jolt through me, electric and undeniable. Her skin warm against the cool dampness of mine. "Hold here," she murmured, voice husky from the proximity, her face inches from my extended arm, the scent of her citrus mingling with the salty tang of exertion. In that suspended moment, her gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second, the reserve cracking to reveal the depth she'd hidden, born from months of observing my grace, the fluid lines I'd honed under her eye, the resilience in my extensions that had stirred something in her long before my voice note shattered the silence. She lowered me slowly, our bodies brushing in the release, sweat-slick skin grazing in a way that blurred instruction into invitation. And we stilled there, breaths sinking in the quiet after the music faded. Faces inches apart, the space between us hummed with possibility, a tangible charge that made the air feel denser, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that peeled back layers. "Lila," she confessed then, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of revelation. "It's reciprocal. Watching you move, the way your body responds to my cues, it's ignited feelings I thought I'd buried under years of discipline. Your grace, the vulnerability you show in every rehearsal, it mirrors my own isolation, pulls at the longing I've denied. But this," her hand hovered near my face, not touching, the restraint a testament to the war within her, eyes dark with the flicker of desire that matched my internal ache. The stillness held us captive, the fluorescent lights casting a stark intimacy over the moment. But reality intruded like a shadow, the studio's rigid rules looming, institutional policies that could strip her authority, end my scholarship in a heartbeat. A decision point emerged then, weighing the desire humming between us against the cage of expectations, her gaze holding mine as we teetered on the edge, the path forward uncertain yet inexorable. The moment fractured under the weight of our proximity, Elena's confession hanging like a fragile bridge between us. But then she withdrew, stepping back with a sharpness that cut through the charged air. Her hand fell away, eyes dropping to the scuffed floor, as if the fluorescent glare had suddenly become too revealing, her posture snapping back into that rigid fortress I'd always known. "We can't," she said, voice steady but laced with a tremor that betrayed the effort it took, turning away to fiddle with the music player on the wall, putting physical distance between us like a barrier rebuilt in an instant. "The policies here, they're ironclad. Institutional rules that protect the program. But they could end my career in a heartbeat. One report from Nadia, one whisper of impropriety, and I'm out. No more coaching, no more shaping lives like yours. I've seen it happen to others. Their authority stripped away for less than this pull between us. We stop now, before it consumes everything." Her retreat hit me like a failed lift, the sudden void where her warmth had been, amplifying the ache I'd carried since that voice note. I stepped forward, closing the gap she'd created, tears welling unbidden as the raw potential of loss clawed at my throat. "Elena, don't pull away like this. It's not just a fantasy anymore. It's us, here, feeling the same storm. If you shut it down now, you're erasing what we've built in these stolen moments, leaving me with nothing but the echo of what could have been." The tears spilled then, hot tracks down my cheeks, exposing the depth of the hurt, the terror of returning to rehearsals where her touches would revert to cold instruction, her gaze averted, the undeniable magnetism we'd acknowledged reduced to silence. My voice broke, a sob catching as I reached for her arm, fingers trembling against the sleeve of her tracksuit. I can't go back to pretending. The ache, it's too profound, too real. In that instant, my mind flashed to the fantasy's origin, those first weeks of the season when exhaustion had cracked my defenses open. It was after a grueling late-night run-through, the studio empty, save for the hum of lights and the faint scent of rosin clinging to the air, my body spent from endless repetitions under her watchful eye. I'd collapsed against the bar, whispering into my phone not as escape, but as a desperate grasp for the peace it promised, a profound, undeniable sanctuary where her corrections transcended technique, her hands mapping not just form, but the hidden curves of longing, her reserve yielding to a shared rhythm that soothed the isolation of our worlds. That imagined intimacy had offered respite from the power's weight, a vision of her breath mingling with mine in the dim glow, turning the cage of discipline into a haven of mutual surrender, underscoring the peace I'd craved amid the rigor she demanded. Elena's vulnerability peaked then, her back still turned, but shoulders slumping under the invisible burden, a hand rising to pinch the bridge of her nose as if to ward off the onslaught. She turned slowly, eyes glistening with unshed emotion, the controlled world she'd mastered fracturing before me. "You think I don't feel it? The fear, it's not of you, Lila, but of what intimacy would disrupt. This life I've carved, the authority that's my armor against chaos. One breach and it all unravels. I've denied connections for so long, watching from the sidelines as others found what we glimpse here, because letting in desire means risking the structure that holds me together. Your words in that note, they awakened it, but now it terrifies me. This longing that could topple everything I've controlled." The exchange heated, anger blending with the undercurrent of longing that refused to fade. My tears fueling a surge as I closed the distance again, voice rising in a mix of frustration and plea. Terrified? Then why does pulling away hurt more than the risk? You're choosing the cage over us, Elena, denying the truth we've both admitted. She whirled, eyes flashing, but the fire softened as our faces neared, her hand lifting to cup my cheek in a desperate reassurance, thumb brushing away a tear with a tenderness that belied her words. I mirrored the gesture, palm against her face, feeling the warmth of her skin, the subtle tremor beneath, our breaths sinking in the charged space. "We don't have to lose this," I whispered, the touch anchoring us amid the storm. "Fight for it with me." Her resolve wavered under my hand, the vulnerability yielding to a tentative spark, resolution building as we lingered there, navigating the path forward together, halting steps toward boundaries redefined, the emotional crisis forging not fracture, but a deeper bond, pulling us toward the rhythm we could no longer deny. From that charged stillness in the annex, Elena's hand lingered on my cheek a moment longer, her thumb tracing a final, reassuring path before we pulled apart, the decision crystallizing in the shared silence that followed. "We'll restructure," she murmured, her voice gaining a quiet resolve, eyes meeting mine with the first unshadowed clarity I'd seen. "I'll speak to the program director about shifting my oversight, perhaps delegating your evaluations to an assistant coach for the season's end. It won't erase the rules, but it carves space for us beyond these walls, away from the studio's unyielding gaze where we can explore without the constant threat of exposure." The agreement settled between us like a tentative pact, her words mapping a path through the institutional maze, allowing the personal to breathe in off hours, unburdened by the power's weight that had confined us. The days blurred into a montage of evolving interactions, each one peeling back layers we'd guarded so fiercely. Our first offsite meeting came under the guise of extra technique review, but we met at a quiet cafe on the city's edge, the scent of fresh espresso mingling with the damp autumn air filtering through open windows. There, away from mirrors and commands, her reserve crumbled further. She spoke of her early years coaching, the isolation that had hardened her edges, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table as if echoing the lines she'd once adjusted on my form. I shared fragments of my own vulnerabilities, the pressure of scholarships, the ache of performing for approval, and felt my confidence bloom under her attentive gaze. No longer the student, but a partner in this unfolding dialogue. Subsequent encounters deepened. A walk through the botanic gardens where rain pattered on leaves like whispered confessions, her hand brushing mine in passing, the contact no longer corrective but chosen. Evenings at her apartment, sparse and ordered yet warming, as we pored over choreography videos, her laughter emerging rare and genuine when I mimicked a botched step from memory. My growth unfurled in tandem, confidence threading through my movements as rehearsals resumed under the new structure. Elena's directives filtered through the assistant, freeing her glances to hold warmth rather than scrutiny. Her softening evident in the subtle nods that affirmed without commanding. She, too, yielded to shared emotional landscapes, her unreadable facade giving way to ruminative depths. Late-night calls where she'd confess the terror of her control slipping. The profound peace in simply being seen beyond authority. The fantasy I'd whispered evolved into reality, realized not in grand gestures but subtle profundities. Her hand steadying my elbow during a casual stretch outside practice. The press evoking that imagined intimacy without the studio's cage. Quiet admissions over shared meals, where her eyes would trace my face with the same intensity she'd once reserved for form, turning longing into a bridge we crossed daily. It culminated one evening after a grueling group session, the studio emptying as twilight seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. We lingered, ostensibly reviewing notes, but the air hummed with the bond we'd forged. "Lila," she said softly, setting aside her clipboard, her voice stripped of command. "This, us, it's love. Not the fleeting spark of fantasy, but the terrifying truth of it, enduring through the risks we've navigated." The words hung, a quiet admission that sealed our rhythm. Her hand finding mine in the dim light, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that spoke volumes. In our final practice scene that week, the ensemble flowed seamlessly. But it was our synchronization in the partnering lift that mirrored our unspoken bond. Bodies aligning without touch, instincts attuned from months of emotional cartography. Her presence a steady anchor that elevated every extension. The transition to reflection came naturally then, affirming the connection's depth. The slow burn we'd ignited, now a flame tempered by truth, pulling us into a future where vulnerability was no longer isolation, but shared sanctuary. Our hands intertwined post-rehearsal, fingers laced in the emptying studio's hush, a symbol of boundaries crossed and rebuilt stronger. The slow burn had ignited into enduring intimacy, our worlds no longer divided by power, but woven in mutual ache. If forbidden connections like this pull at you, subscribe for more tales of unspoken longing. Share your hidden desires in the comments below.